Well, hey there, idiots. Welcome back to Observe. In today's video, I'm going to be analyzing the nonverbal communication of Dr. Phil in his response to Danielle Bregoli and her video in which she speaks up about the experience she had at the ranch that has been featured many times on Dr. Phil's show. There are a couple things that I want to make clear before continuing. First, nonverbal communication reading is on average 70 to 80% accurate with a little bit of leeway on either side. Along with that, these videos are designed for entertainment and some educational purposes. They should not be used legally or in any professional setting outside of this. Also, this video is not going to be centered around the morality or legality of these ranches or on Danielle's body language in and of herself. This is in relation to Dr. Phil and whether or not he was aware of the actions that were being carried out at the ranch that his company promotes and whether or not his apology, if he offers one, is sincere. That is all that this video is about. You are welcome to share your opinions on the other sides of things in the comments below, but I will not be focusing on them here. That's enough talking. Let's go ahead and roll the intro. Now, for those of you who don't know and to be able to catch you up to speed, Danielle, also known as Bhad Bhabie, has been seen on the Dr. Phil show in the past, and she became famous for the line, "Cash me outside, how about that?" Due to her problematic behavior, she was sent to a ranch to be able to help facilitate a new behavioral pattern. During that time, she speaks of a very harsh environment. Now, as I said, this video is not focusing on her testimony, or the experiences of the people that have gone to these ranches. This is focusing on Dr. Phil's response alone. I hope to be able to add some clarity to the situation, to find out to the best of my abilities if Dr. Phil was being honest, or if he was at all aware of the actions being carried out at the ranch. Let's go ahead and begin into the analysis.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick break, but when we come back after the break, I need to ask you some tough questions about a teenage rapper who was out in the papers this weekend saying that she's angry with you for a suggested boot camp that she went.
Interesting. So the interviewer, which all of this entire footage I have edited to focus exclusively on Dr. Phil's face. Otherwise, there's not really a point to it. This will help us hone in on his actions, his nonverbal communication, much more easily than if we're distracted with multiple different faces. So you'll see this. This is kind of awkward to watch because it's just focusing on him, but it is necessary. Along with that, there will be segments where it's showing B-roll and so on and so forth that I have taken out to help avoid being copyright claimed by his studio because it's extremely copyright claim happy. Also, I have changed the pitch of their voices lightly so everything's just a little bit higher to help further foil those copyright claiming systems. But real quick, what I do want to note is that as soon as she says that she's going to be asking some tough questions, you can see that he starts breathing a little bit more heavily. Now, something that you can't see is that just before this, he was doing a long spell of talking, and that can make some people have to breathe a little bit more heavily, especially if it's the first sentences, so on and so forth of an interview. So it could be in relation to the tough question. It could be in relation to the fact that he just finished speaking. Likelihood is that increase of breathing, which would be a psychophysiological response, that increase of breathing is probably related to both. He's probably feeling a little bit of stress in regards to the tough questions that are about to follow, and he's probably catching his breath from just speaking earlier before. Let's continue.
To, and she's demanding an apology. I'm going to ask you about that, but I also want to ask you the bigger question too about how we as Americans are really becoming more and more polarized, and it's not just.
Okay, so something that I will note about Dr. Phil is that you could tell he has been on camera a fair bit because he has this neutral face that he's able to keep. Take note of his mouth position. It does have a little bit higher corner on one side of his mouth. Some could read this as contempt, but since it's consistent and it's continuous, that lends me to believe that this is part of his baseline. This is how his face would normally sit while listening. This is a trained expression of neutrality. So during this time, there's not too much to be able to read. His blink rate is average, if a little fast, and everything else is lining up outside of those breathing spells that he has in there, which we've already covered.
Democrat, Republican, it's QAnon, it's who you believe, it's the neighbors you're accusing, and I'm just wondering if there's a checkup that we can do for America as well. So those questions and more, and a little more iced tea with Dr. Phil after the break. So Phil,
So when he raises his glass before the cut there, you could see that the smile doesn't reach his eyes. This is a forced smile. This is a TV smile. This is a performance smile. He's not super happy or overwhelmed with joy while doing this interview. Neither should he be. It's just an interview to him. And now, though, after the cut, you can see that he has a little bit stronger of a smile. This might be because they said some jokes in between, or they said, hey, why don't you smile a little bit more convincingly for the camera? Regardless, the smile afterwards is more genuine than the smile before. This has nothing really to do with the actual content of this video besides helping establish his nonverbal patterns and behaviors to help us better understand his credibility and validity later on.
I'm reading the New York Post this weekend. I open up this story about a teen rapper named Bhad Bhabie, B-H-A-B-I, and her real name is Danielle Bregoli, and she's saying, I want an apology from Dr. Phil, and if I don't get an apology by some date, I'm going to handle it my own way. She says that...
Okay, so you can see small movements in his smile, his neutral smile that he keeps, his camera smile. So you can see that smile lessening as she continues on speaking of this teenager whose name is Danielle, who calls herself bad, blah, 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 all of this. And you could see that smile starting to lessen, and then he looks down and he does a small chuckle. And this would mean that now, as you could see the other corner of his mouth moving upwards, that's the only side of his mouth that's moving upwards. The other side has maintained stillness. So we've established that that initial expression, that blank, neutral camera look that he has, is blank. That's all that it is. However, this smile, meaning that it's moving up only on the one side of his mouth, is an indicator of contempt. Right off the bat, he has a moral or intellectual superiority centered around this person, Danielle, to which the interviewer is referring. That's important for us to be able to note emotionally for Dr. Phil because it helps lay some foundations for the rest of this small segment.
I was on his show 5 years ago, and I was recommended to go off to this boot camp, and they were abusive at this boot camp. I want to play this, the soundbite from your show so everybody knows who this person is and what she was like at 13 years old. Her mom brought her on the show to say, I can't handle her anymore. So here's that moment off your show. Boy,
So I went ahead and skipped that moment. If you would like to be able to see the whole thing, I will link the actual interview in the description below so you can see all the footage and help you catch up and everything around that. There wasn't anything that's applicable to the nonverbal analysis side of things, so I didn't keep it in here. If you would like to see more, follow the link in the description below. Now we're going to start to get to the actual meat of the matter with Dr. Phil. We'll see how he responds, see if there's any sort of emotional seepage or leakage that we can cue in on to really understand his genuine emotion about things rather than what he's presenting perhaps with his words. Let's watch.
I had a vague recollection of that young. And by the way, let's remind everyone.
So you can see he's shaking his head, he's looking down. The looking down doesn't mean anything in this part because it's likely that he's looking at notes. It's not related to a specific time in a sentence for him to be able to have an emotional reaction to. It could be related to him doing some psychological processing in the background, so he's looking down to be able to better do that. But likelihood is there are notes down there. But you can see that he raises his eyebrows here. This can be used to amplify words, but it's also a mini expression of surprise or fear. Due to the angle of his eyebrows in this, it would be related to the surprise side of things. And you could tie this into a, whoa, kind of surprise. So while it's still surprise, it's not like he's just shocked out of his mind, but it's reflecting on his face. You could still see that he has this slight contempt smile on his face, but it's not overwhelming. Let's continue watching to see what his body language says.
And that was 13. Not sure how I would have handled that 13-year-old if she were my 13-year-old. But let's talk about her and what she's now...
So he keeps a pretty steady expression throughout all of this. This means that it's very forced and very trained. This, like I said, comes due to his time spent in front of a camera and having done many, many interviews by this point. So he keeps a very blank expression, making it hard for somebody like me to be able to analyze, especially since I don't have a very high resolution file of this. But during this time, I haven't seen any seepage of disgust or contempt in regards to times that the interviewer is mentioning Danielle. So that is good in and of itself because that means that he's not at least subconsciously leaking it. He could still not like Danielle, but he's not showing it non-verbally. That's good news, at least.
Doing in her accusations. She says that the place that she was recommended to go was abusive to her, wouldn't let her sleep. What are your responses to her?
Well, she went to Turnabout 4 or 5 years ago, and if she had a bad experience, obviously I would.
So he's having some trouble verbally speaking right now. There's a lot of stutters, there's a lot of stammers. This can actually go either way for deceit or authenticity. And during this time, it's not really able to be determined which it is. However, you can hear him have multiple false starts to where he starts on a sentence and then he changes it. And this is psychological processing, and it can be a red flag for deceit. What was that initial line that they were going to say? This sort of change, what was the initial line of thought that he was beginning on going to be? It could just be him panicking and saying some words because he's nervous, not as likely because he's a TV personality. He's more collected than that, and he's been referring to notes. So my question would be, what were you going to say there? It's far from definitive at this point, but it is something to make note of, especially continuing on throughout the rest of the read.
I would hate that. We'd be sorry about that, but we don't have anything to do with what happens with guests once they...
Okay, so something that I will also say verbally again is that he uses the phrases, we would and would have, this idea of if this thing were this case, then we would have done this. So there's two reasons psychologically that people end up doing this. In this case, he could be saying, well, I don't believe her, but if she is telling the truth, then we would be doing this. But that indicates that he doesn't believe her. The other option is that he does believe her, but he's trying to build a separate narrative. Perhaps it's not, this is what we did do, but this is what we would have done in a better world, had we behaved correctly, had we not done X, Y, Z. So there is the possibility that he just flippantly said, I would have done this and we would have done this. There is that possibility. It doesn't quite make sense in this context, but it is still something that I am keeping track of as things continue on.
Leave the stage. I mean, that's between the guardian and the parent and whatever facility they go to. So we're not involved in that. We don't have any feedback from them. So whatever happens once they're there, that's between them and the facility. I assume she had a problem. She filed a complaint with the proper authorities or something 5 years ago. So I really don't know much about it.
So during this time, a lot of this is verbal and tonal and pitch. You can't hear too many changes in his pitch, so you have to pay attention to the places where he has hesitations. Why does he have those hesitations? Is it just out of sheer force of needing to breathe? Is it because of psychological processing behind it? You have to look at what is being said and when hesitations happen, when tonal changes happen, when pitch changes happen. So far throughout this part, as far as his tone, the consistency of his voice, the pitch has stayed pretty constant, and the tone itself has stayed pretty constant. It hasn't gotten more gruff or more melodic as the vocal cords change. It also hasn't changed in volume. He's stayed a very, very flat pitch. This is a very trained response. You can tell that he is trained to respond to interviewers without quite incriminating himself on any level. That being said, earlier on, as they're talking about these allegations, he does have some times where he's shrugging in there, and you could see his head doing micro movements no. Now, the micro movements no could be related to two main meanings. One is that he's shaking his head no in relation to the negativity of the entire situation. In America, the no shake like this, left to right, means no. But if you nod your head up and down like this, that means yes. Since Dr. Phil is American, we're going to be functioning off of that system of movement. So during that time, he could either be saying, no, I didn't like any of this, I don't like the negativity of it, there's nothing that I appreciate about this, and that's the small movements of the head no. Or it could be that he's saying the one thing and then the no shake is quite literally contradicting it non-verbally, and since it's a small micro movement, it would be more truthful. In this case, we can't really say based off of the science alone, we just know that it's related to a negative. But in this specific case, it would seem irregular that a large company, a large production company, and Dr. Phil, who has been on air for a long time and has to support these various ranches or places that kids can go, it would seem odd that they didn't know about some of this action. And during that time, if you look at it with that context, then the nose shake would be more related to possible deceit. This is where it gets a little bit muddy non-verbally because we can't say that for certain, but it does make sense contextually with the rest of the information taken in mind. Let's continue watching this.
So there's the other issue is like when you have a child like that who is incorrigible. I mean, I just watched that behavior and I thought, wow, first of all, calling a group of people you don't know who are mostly your elders a bunch of hoes and then saying, catch me outside, how about that? Meaning I'm going to beat you up outside. We didn't even show the part of the clip where she came at her mom on this.
So I know a lot of people can see that gesture that he just did there. What he did is this move here or this move or any move like that, that's called a manipulator. That's when you touch or manipulate anything with your hands. So this is a manipulator, this is a manipulator, this is a manipulator, twirling your hair is a manipulator, so on and so forth. So this itch here is a manipulator. Now there's the possibility that due to the timing that occurred, that it could be in relation to the words that were said. And in that case, that reach across could be seen as a blocking gesture or a distancing gesture, which would be in relation to the negativity centered around it. There is that possibility. There's not enough to say right now, but it is something that we have made note of. By the end of the video, hopefully we can have enough of an idea that we can give an educated opinion. And that's the best that we can give in any video analysis like this. That's the best that we can give because we simply are working with too little information. A single video, no matter how much background research you've done to be able to establish baseline, so on and so forth, a single video is simply never going to be enough. You always will need more to be able to have what would be arguably a concrete, solid, almost like mathematical answer, as opposed to this is what is likely happening. And in psychology, there are so many shades of gray to begin with that it's almost never black or white. That's enough talk of that. Let's continue watching.
Stage, because her mom said she was mouthy. You know, what do you do with young people like that? What else is there but some tough love, you know, at a ranch or where else? You can't coddle kids like that.
So you can hear the interviewer is very, very biased with her presentation. She's asking extremely pointed and manipulative questions. And during that, even Dr. Phil doesn't have emotional leakage. He doesn't nod to support her. He doesn't shake his head. He doesn't sleep in any disgust or contempt in relation to what she's saying. That is an indicator that he's highly trained in what he's doing now in presenting to camera well. And so that makes it to where my analysis is going to be even more difficult and even more nuanced because it's evident that he knows what he's doing quite well. But the good news is that he hasn't bitten any of her little lures that she's thrown out there to see if she can get him to say something very incriminating or very biased or very inflammatory. He didn't do that. He just kind of moved right on by them, let them happen, and he didn't even acknowledge it emotionally through his body language. That's good to know. That means that for the most part, from what we could see, keeping in mind that he has training, that he's pretty unbiased in regards to this. That's better than being completely in the know and disliking Danielle herself. That's good news at least.
Well, you know, I think every situation is different, and there are a lot of these children, teenagers and adolescents that my approach has been, I don't ask myself why you're the way you are, I ask myself why not, because if you look at their upbringing, and I'm not talking about this story, it was 5 years ago, I don't remember too much about it, but you know, kids are raised in different environments, and you've got to look at each case separately. Some of them were raised in a lot of chaos and a lot of turmoil, and so they do what they have to survive. But you still have to protect them from themselves. And I think that the main thing is to, you know, get the child through that year, then get them through the next year, then the next year, and then pretty soon they're adults and you've gotten them through that tough patch. And that's the hard thing that parents have to make a decision about is, you know, what path do I take? And, you know, we point parents in a direction of, I try to be.
So this part is interesting. I'll talk about all of this spiel that he just had. Largely it was uneventful. There were no anomalies, there were no flags that stuck out to me. There were no spikes in his vocal intonations or tonal intonations, pitch, anything to stick out as odd. It was still very neutral all the way around. And then when it cut back to his face, average blink rate, there were no seepages, there was no disgust, there was no contempt, there was no seepage of any of the 7 universal emotions that I could possibly pick up on or mixes therein. It's very neutral. He's obviously trained. Now it's getting to this part to where they say they refer parents to various things. And I think he might be realizing that this is stepping into some dangerous ground, because then he realizes that he has to advocate for certain ranches, various treatments, so on and so forth, and he realizes that this could be a little bit testy for him. So you could see his blinking increase dramatically. This could be seen as a blocking gesture, but at very least it can be seen as psychological processing or a desire to not say what's being said. Along with that, his words start to halt as well. That means that there's a complexity occurring in his psychological processing right now. Up until this point, he had been talking very smoothly with some uhs and normal verbal patterns, but then it gets to this point and he falls apart a little bit. Our question as a viewer, or in my case as an analyst, is why does it pop up there? What is causing that? This would be where you would ask more questions. And here's the thing with asking questions. You don't want to ask, so why are you acting so suspicious about this? Because then you're going to get a lot of nervous behavior centered around that. What you would rather do is let the conversation go on a bit, gather enough data, and then revisit it later on in the guise of more interest. Because technically speaking, you're more interested in that part. But you don't want it to seem on an attack. You want to seem it as, I want to be more in the know with this sort of situation, with the information here, so on and so forth, to see if you could eventually chip away and get them to show more signs of deceit. So if I had been asking those, that's what my approach would have been, to be able to see if I could really understand what that nonverbal spike of activity that just occurred was related to. What caused it? Let's continue.
Emotional compass and point parents in a direction. If they're being inconsistent with their parenting or something, I try to point that out, put it on a to-do list for them. But the real work starts, once they get home and have to realign what they're doing. And it's not easy in this day and time. There's social media influences, fast-paced life. Kids grow up really fast these days.
Okay, and he says kids grow up really fast these days. He has a nose shake, he leans forward, and this is to really amplify what he's saying as if it's more groundbreaking than it could possibly be. All in all, when we watched through this, thinking back on it, we saw a lot of neutrality in all the channels of observation that we work for in nonverbal analysis. This includes tone, the voice. We'll just group all of that together in the voice, the face, and the body language itself. He had some repositioning, he had some blocking gestures, some manipulators, and there were certain areas that seemed suspicious. Now, considering the context of everything, using just a little bit of logical processing detached from the actual evidence itself, we can maybe infer some things. Non-verbally speaking, there were moments of possible desynchronization, possible deception opportunities, and areas where it could be related to blocking, defensive gestures, so on and so forth. Non-verbally, that's all that we could really say. If we take a step out and ask the question, why were those there, and fill it in with perhaps information that we know on the outside, then we might be able to get a clearer picture. So with that in mind, considering the workflow of a studio of people who are on the on-screen talent side of things, production, everything that's centered around creating a TV show like Dr. Phil, and the studio that goes with it, the chances of nobody knowing what was going on at the ranch are slim to none. It's very unrealistic to assume that they are just not at all aware. There's the possibility, but it's unlikely. There's too much money at risk, quite literally, to allow that to happen. And then Dr. Phil being the head of the show, while it has been said that some on-screen talent can be unaware of what the studio is doing, and there are always facets that are unaware, it's unlikely that Dr. Phil was unaware. We could say that just by looking at it. Now, if we consider that and see what we saw non-verbally, then this is where we get to my opinion. My opinion is that Dr. Phil knows good and well what is occurring at these locations. His body language showed signs of possible deception during that, and the context in which everything is nestled lends us to believe that that is not true. It's not black and white, never is, So I'm not saying that he is for sure lying, but in my opinion, based off of the evidence we have, it seems like the likeliest option. Now, I know that this was a very short little analysis with a lot of words packed in there. I want to be able to take opportunities with shorter videos to be able to talk about more of the methodology behind nonverbal analysis, what goes into it, the questioning that has to accompany it, and the limitations that are actually in the field, because out there are plenty of other channels or blogs or websites that will say that you can get black and white answers for sure from nonverbal communication when in and of itself, it's not a black and white science. There's too much nuance. There's too much that is still unknown about the human mind to be able to get to a black and white. There are areas where, yes, you can get to where it's more or less truth or lie. You can get to that point. You'll never see it here on YouTube on any channel because there's never enough research. I can just guarantee you that. There's just never enough research. But we can get pretty darn close. So in this case, I feel pretty certain, I would say about between 70 and 75% certain that he knows exactly what's going on at those ranches, or at least a good amount of detail as to what's going on, the methodologies that are carried out there, so on and so forth. So that's my analysis here. I hope you appreciated it. If you have any suggestions for other videos that you would like me to analyze, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'm open to true crime, YouTube drama, everything like that. If there are enough comments saying the same option, then it will likely be done next. If you did like this video, consider hitting the like button, hit subscribe if you want to see more, hit the bell if you haven't already. You know the spiel of everything. If you want to be able to support the channel and receive some extra content, head over to Patreon. There's some exclusive content over there and it helps support the channel. If you want to get some cool merch, that's down there as well. I just released the 7 Universal Emotions line of merch, which I think looks pretty okay and doesn't look very YouTube merchy in my opinion, which I also appreciate because I'm not a big merch person like that. But without further ado, that's all that I've got for today. My name is Logan and you have been oh so awesome as you always are. And I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.